All right, let's get right into it. Tucked away in the final chapter of the book of Romans, there's a single verse that has launched a biblical mystery that's been debated for nearly 2,000 years. And at the heart of it all is one name, Junia. So, was she one of the most prominent women in the early church, a female apostle, or is there more to the story? That's what we're going to investigate, digging into the evidence presented in our source material to unpack this really fascinating question.
And here it is. This is the verse that's at the center of the entire debate. The Apostle Paul is giving a shout out to two people, Andronicus and Junia, and he describes them with this crucial phrase, who are of note among the apostles. Sounds simple enough, right? But what does that actually mean? Well, that is the million-dollar question, and it's where our investigation really begins.
So there's the big question right there. Now, this is a subject of huge scholarly debate. To really understand one major perspective on this, we're going to walk through the evidence our source material presents that argues against Junia holding the official title of apostle. And we'll start with the job requirements.
Okay, first up, Exhibit A, the job requirements. Before we can decide if Junia fits the role, we have to understand what this particular view defines as the scriptural standard for the official office of apostle. You gotta know the job description, right?
So check out the pattern this source material points to. The argument starts with Jesus himself. He had tons of devoted female followers, but he chose 12 men to be that foundation. Then, fast forward a bit, when they need to replace Judas, what's the requirement? It had to be a man who had been there from the very beginning. So from this point of view, you see a really consistent pattern. Every single person given that official foundational title of apostle is male.
And this is a huge piece of the puzzle for this argument. It really comes down to one little Greek word. You see, in the original language of the book of Acts, when Peter is laying out those job requirements, he uses the word andron. And that's not just a generic word for person or human. That would be anthropos. Nope. Andron specifically means male. For folks who hold this view, this isn't just a coincidence. They see it as a deliberate, defining qualification for the job.
Okay, so that's the argument from precedent. Now let's shift gears to Exhibit B and zoom way in on the grammar of that original verse in Romans. This is where things get super nitty-gritty. All right, here it is. This is the phrase at the center of the storm, episemoi en tois apostolos. In our English Bibles, it usually says something like, of note among the apostles. But here's the kicker. In the original Greek, you can actually read this phrase in two totally different ways. And this slide lays out those two options perfectly. Is it the inclusive view? That would mean Junia was part of the group of apostles and a really well-known one. Or is it the exclusive view, which is what our source material argues for? That would mean she wasn't an apostle herself, but she was famous to the apostles. They knew her, they respected her work, but she wasn't in the club, so to speak. And to help wrap your head around that exclusive view, the source gives this really helpful analogy. Think about a university. You could be a star researcher who is well-known among the faculty. All the professors know who you are, they respect your work, but that doesn't actually make you a professor. This view is saying that's the deal with Junia and Andronicus. They were A-listers in the eyes of the apostles without actually holding the office themselves. And there's another little linguistic detail the source brings up. Paul calls them his kinsmen, or syngenes. Now, in Greek, that word is a masculine plural noun. It can include women, sure, but the source suggests that using this masculine-leaning term here might be another small hint that fits into this overall picture of a male-led missionary team. All right, for our last piece of evidence, Exhibit C, we're going to pull the camera way back. We've been looking at tiny Greek words in one specific verse. Now we're going to look at the bigger picture, the broader leadership patterns that the source material says support this whole argument. So, how does the source pull all this together? Well, it uses this really memorable framework called the 3 Ps of male headship. It's basically a way to build a step-by-step case for why, from this perspective, the top-tier church offices, like apostle, were set up for men. So let's break them down real quick. First, precedent. That's about the consistent history of male leadership, all the way from the Old Testament priests right up to the 12 apostles. Then, pattern. The idea here is that the rules for a lower office, like an elder having to be the husband of one wife, would naturally apply up the chain of command to the higher office of apostle. And finally, precept. This points directly to a command from Paul in 1 Timothy, which this view interprets as a clear instruction that women shouldn't hold the kind of final teaching authority an apostle would have over men.
Okay, so we've looked at the job requirements, the tricky Greek grammar, and the big picture patterns. Where does all of this land? Well, the final verdict from this perspective really comes down to a super important distinction about what the word apostle can even mean.
You know, it's funny. For all the debate, the root word itself, apostolos, is actually pretty straightforward. In Greek, it literally just means one who is sent, or even simpler, a messenger. And remembering that simple definition is the key to unlocking the conclusion of this entire argument.
And here it is, the two types of apostles side by side. On one side, you've got the office of apostle with a capital O. This is that foundational, authoritative role held by the original 12 and Paul. But on the other side, you've got the general gift or function of being an apostolos, a messenger, a missionary, someone sent out by a church. The source points to Epaphroditus as a great example of this second, broader use of the word.
So, here's the bottom line. The final verdict from this particular viewpoint is this. Junia could absolutely have been a highly respected, well-known, and incredibly effective apostolos, a messenger for the gospel, a trailblazing missionary, even. But this view concludes that doesn't automatically mean she held the formal, foundational office of apostle that was reserved for the 12.
And that really wraps up our investigation into this side of the argument. It's kind of wild, isn't it? How a 2,000-year-old debate over just a few words in a single verse can still have such a massive impact, shaping how institutions are structured even today. It really makes you think about how much weight interpretation carries, and the debate, for sure, is far from over.